June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m., Normandy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in his study at Herrlingen, Germany, 500 miles from the beaches where the largest invasion in history was unfolding. The Desert Fox, Germany's most famous general, was celebrating his wife's 50th birthday, while Allied forces stormed ashore at the very fortifications he had spent months preparing. Rommel had left Normandy 2 days earlier, based on weather reports that declared invasion impossible. Storms in the English Channel, he was assured, would prevent any large-scale amphibious operation for at least a week. It seemed like the perfect time for a quick trip home. Instead, 150,000 Allied troops were landing on beaches that Rommel had fortified according to his own strategic vision, rather than Adolf Hitler's explicit orders. For months, the Führer had demanded that German defenses follow a specific doctrine: mobile reserves positioned inland, ready to counterattack any invasion after it came ashore. Rommel had ignored those orders completely. The field marshal had concentrated German strength at the beaches themselves, believing that Allied forces had to be stopped in the surf or not at all. His strategy violated Hitler's defensive concept, contradicted the recommendations of his superior officers, and defied German military doctrine. It also handed the Allies exactly the defensive arrangement they had hoped to encounter. This is the story of how Rommel ignored his orders and inadvertently saved D-Day, how the Desert Fox's strategic judgment helped ensure Allied success, and how the field marshal, who was supposed to stop the invasion, became the man whose decisions made invasion possible. The fatal decision began 6 months earlier, when Rommel inherited Germany's coastal defenses and decided that Hitler's strategy was wrong. December 1943. Rommel arrived in France with orders to strengthen the Atlantic Wall fortifications along the Channel coast. Hitler's defensive concept was simple: create strong beach obstacles to delay invasion forces, then use mobile panzer reserves to destroy the beachheads with massive counterattacks. The strategy made tactical sense according to traditional German military doctrine. German armor could concentrate overwhelming force against scattered invasion forces, destroying Allied beachheads before they could be reinforced or expanded. Mobile defense had worked effectively against Allied landings in Italy, and Hitler believed the same approach would succeed in France. But Rommel had experienced something that Hitler and most German commanders had not: total Allied air supremacy. During the North African campaign, Rommel had watched Allied aircraft destroy German columns, attempting to maneuver in daylight. He had seen what happened to panzer reserves when they tried to move under Allied air cover. Mobile defense required mobility, and mobility was impossible when enemy aircraft controlled the skies completely. Rommel's conclusion was strategically sound, but strategically disastrous. German forces had to stop the invasion at the beaches because they would never survive the movement required for mobile counterattacks. The logic was impeccable, but the implications were catastrophic for German defensive planning. January 1944. Rommel began implementing his defensive strategy in direct violation of Hitler's explicit orders. Instead of positioning German reserves inland for mobile operations, Rommel moved them forward to man-beach fortifications. Instead of preparing counterattack capabilities, he focused on creating impenetrable coastal defenses. The approach solved the mobility problem that Rommel had identified, but it created new problems that were even more serious. Beach defenses, no matter how strong, could be overwhelmed by concentrated Allied assault. Once Allied forces established secure beachheads, German defenders would have no reserves available for counterattacks. Rommel's strategy traded tactical flexibility for defensive strength. If his beach defenses held, the invasion would fail. If they were breached anywhere, the entire defensive system would collapse because no mobile reserves existed to restore the situation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group West, protested Rommel's modifications to defensive planning. Coastal fortifications cannot stop a determined invasion, Rundstedt argued. We must retain mobile reserves to destroy enemy forces after they come ashore. Rommel's response revealed his fundamental disagreement with German strategic thinking. Mobile reserves will never reach the battlefield under Allied air supremacy. Our only hope is to prevent establishment of beachheads entirely. The debate split German defensive planning between two incompatible approaches and created exactly the defensive weakness that Allied planning would exploit. February 1944. Rommel's modifications to German defensive strategy accelerated despite growing opposition from his superiors. Every panzer division transferred to coastal defense weakened Germany's mobile reserve capability. Every artillery battery positioned for beach defense reduced Germany's inland counterattack potential. The changes were systematic and comprehensive. Rommel was not simply modifying Hitler's strategy, he was replacing it entirely with his own strategic vision. German defenses were being reorganized according to principles that contradicted established military doctrine and violated explicit orders from the highest command authority. Most critically, Rommel's changes were creating exactly the defensive arrangement that Allied intelligence had identified as most favorable to invasion success. Strong beach defenses that could inflict casualties but not prevent landings, combined with weak mobile reserves that could not eliminate established beachheads. Allied planners monitoring German defensive preparations through aerial reconnaissance and resistance reports noted Rommel's violations of German defensive doctrine with considerable relief. The field marshal, who was supposed to make invasion impossible, was instead creating conditions that made invasion possible. March 1944. Hitler attempted to resolve the strategic disagreement by compromise, a solution that satisfied neither Rommel's coastal defense concept nor Rundstedt's mobile defense doctrine. Some German forces would man beach fortifications while others remained inland as mobile reserves. The compromise was strategically disastrous because it provided insufficient strength for either approach. Beach defenses were too weak to stop concentrated Allied assault, while mobile reserves were too weak to destroy established beachheads. Germany would have neither impenetrable coastal fortifications nor effective counterattack capabilities. But Rommel continued implementing his preferred strategy despite Hitler's compromise orders. He concentrated German forces in coastal positions, weakened mobile reserves through constant transfers to beach defenses, and created exactly the defensive arrangement that Allied planning had assumed would provide the best chance for invasion success. The insubordination was systematic and comprehensive. Rommel was not simply modifying Hitler's orders, he was ignoring them entirely. German defensive strategy was being determined by a field marshal's personal judgment rather than by official policy established at the highest levels of command. April 1944. Allied intelligence confirmed that German defensive preparations were proceeding according to Rommel's strategic vision rather than Hitler's explicit orders. Beach fortifications were being strengthened while mobile reserves were being weakened. Coastal defense was taking precedence over mobile counterattack capability. The intelligence was encouraging from an Allied perspective, but devastating from a German one. Rommel's strategic judgment was creating defensive conditions that favored Allied success over German resistance. The field marshal's experience with Allied air power had led him to adopt defensive strategies that served Allied interests better than German ones. SHAEF planners had based D-Day planning on assumptions about German defensive weaknesses that Rommel's strategy was making reality. German beach defenses would be strong enough to cause heavy casualties, but too weak to prevent beachhead establishment. German mobile reserves would be too distant to influence initial fighting. Rommel's defensive preparations were creating exactly those conditions that Allied planning required for success. May 1944. Allied invasion planning was based on assumptions about German defensive weaknesses that Rommel's strategy was making reality. SHAEF planners had assumed that German beach defenses would be strong enough to cause heavy casualties but too weak to prevent beachhead establishment, and that German mobile reserves would be too distant to influence initial fighting. Rommel's defensive preparations were creating exactly those conditions. By concentrating German strength in coastal fortifications, Rommel was ensuring that German forces would be defeated in detail rather than concentrated against Allied weak points. Beach defenses could resist individual Allied assault units, but couldn't prevent multiple simultaneous landings from establishing secure beachheads. More critically, Rommel's weakening of mobile reserves meant that German counterattacks would lack the strength to destroy Allied beachheads, even if they managed to reach the battlefield quickly. Allied commanders had planned D-Day assuming that German defenses would be arranged according to Rommel's preferences rather than Hitler's orders. Rommel was giving them exactly what they had hoped for. The irony was devastating. Germany's most competent field commander was creating the conditions for German defeat, while believing he was ensuring German victory. June 4, 1944. Rommel departed Normandy for Germany based on weather reports that convinced him invasion was impossible for at least a week. The decision to leave his command during the invasion window demonstrated how completely Rommel had misunderstood Allied capabilities and intentions. The weather that German meteorologists declared prohibitive for amphibious operations was exactly what Allied planners had identified as marginally acceptable. Rommel's assessment of invasion possibilities was based on German assumptions about Allied risk tolerance rather than actual Allied planning parameters. More critically, Rommel's departure meant that German coastal defenses would face their ultimate test without the commander who had designed them according to his own strategic vision rather than official German doctrine. The field marshal who had ignored Hitler's orders was not present to see whether his disobedience would prove strategically sound or strategically catastrophic. June 6, 1944. The D-Day landings encountered exactly the defensive arrangement that Allied planning had assumed would provide the best chance for success. German beach defenses were strong enough to cause heavy casualties at Omaha Beach, but too dispersed to prevent beachhead establishment at Gold, Juno, Sword, and Utah beaches. More critically, German mobile reserves were too weak and too distant to mount effective counterattacks against established Allied positions. Rommel's strategy had traded away the counterattack capability that might have destroyed Allied beachheads in exchange for beach defenses that could delay but not prevent Allied landings. The results validated Allied assumptions and German fears. Beach fortifications inflicted casualties but couldn't stop determined assault forces. Mobile reserves, weakened by Rommel's transfers to coastal defense, lacked the strength to eliminate beachheads once established. By evening, Allied forces had achieved every D-Day objective, despite facing coastal defenses that Rommel had strengthened according to his own strategic judgment rather than Hitler's explicit orders. The field marshal, who was supposed to stop D-Day, had instead created the defensive conditions that made D-Day successful. June 7, 1944. Rommel returned to Normandy to find that his defensive strategy had failed completely. Allied forces were consolidating beachheads that German mobile reserves were too weak to eliminate. The coastal fortifications that Rommel had strengthened by violating Hitler's orders had been breached or bypassed across the entire invasion front. Worst of all, German forces had no coherent strategy for responding to successful Allied landings because Rommel's modifications to defensive planning had eliminated the mobile reserve capabilities that might have restored the situation. Rommel's strategic judgment had created exactly the conditions that made Allied success possible: strong enough beach defenses to provide false confidence about German defensive capabilities, but weak enough mobile reserves to ensure that successful landings couldn't be reversed. The field marshal who was supposed to stop D-Day had designed the defensive system that made D-Day successful. June 17, 1944. Hitler finally visited France to assess the Normandy situation and discovered that his explicit orders about defensive strategy had been ignored completely. Rommel had implemented coastal defense doctrine despite clear instructions to maintain mobile reserve capabilities. The confrontation revealed the complete breakdown of German command authority that Rommel's insubordination had created. Hitler's strategy might have been flawed, but Rommel's unauthorized modifications had been disastrous. Why were my orders regarding mobile reserves not implemented? Hitler demanded. Rommel's response demonstrated how completely he had prioritized personal judgment over command authority. Mobile defense is impossible under Allied air supremacy. Coastal defense was the only viable strategy. Hitler's reply was prophetic. Your coastal defense has failed completely. Allied forces are now established beyond any possibility of elimination. Your strategy has guaranteed exactly the result we sought to prevent. The assessment was accurate. Rommel's violation of orders had created the conditions for German defeat in Normandy, July 17, 1944. Rommel was severely wounded in an Allied air attack while traveling between defensive positions, a casualty of the air supremacy that had influenced his strategic thinking from the beginning. The field marshal who had modified German defensive strategy to account for Allied air power became a victim of that same air power. More significantly, Rommel's injuries removed him from command at exactly the moment when his strategic judgment might have been most valuable. Having created defensive conditions that guaranteed Allied success, Rommel was no longer available to adapt German strategy to changing circumstances. German defenses in Normandy would continue according to Rommel's strategic vision without Rommel's strategic flexibility. The field marshal's greatest strategic failure had become his final contribution to German defeat. August 25, 1944. The Normandy campaign ended with complete Allied victory and German collapse across the entire front. Allied forces had achieved every strategic objective, while German forces suffered casualties and equipment losses that ended their ability to conduct effective defensive operations. The final accounting revealed the full impact of Rommel's decision to ignore Hitler's defensive orders. German coastal defenses had delayed but not prevented Allied landings, while weakened mobile reserves had proven incapable of eliminating established beachheads. Allied success in Normandy was possible because German defenses were arranged according to Rommel's strategic preferences rather than German defensive doctrine. The field marshal's violations of explicit orders had created exactly the defensive weaknesses that Allied planning had assumed would provide the best chance for invasion success. October 1944. Rommel's involvement in the July 20th plot against Hitler led to his forced suicide, ending the career of Germany's most famous field marshal. But Rommel's greatest contribution to Allied victory had occurred months earlier, when his strategic judgment had overruled Hitler's explicit orders about Normandy defenses. By concentrating German forces in coastal fortifications rather than mobile reserves, Rommel had created defensive conditions that made D-Day success possible. His violations of command authority had eliminated Germany's best hope for defeating the invasion through mobile counterattacks. The irony was complete. Germany's most competent defensive commander had designed the defensive system that ensured German defeat. Rommel's strategic brilliance had been turned against German interests by his refusal to follow Hitler's orders. The field marshal who was supposed to save the Reich had instead saved the invasion that would destroy it. Post-war analysis confirmed what Allied planners had hoped and German commanders had feared. Rommel's defensive strategy had been perfectly suited to Allied capabilities and intentions. Beach defenses strong enough to cause casualties but too weak to prevent landings, combined with mobile reserves too weak to eliminate beachheads, had created ideal conditions for Allied success. German military historians concluded that Hitler's original defensive concept might have been more effective than Rommel's modifications. Mobile reserves positioned inland might have been vulnerable to Allied air attack, but they would have posed a greater threat to established beachheads than the dispersed coastal defenses that Rommel had created. The ultimate assessment was devastating. Rommel's strategic judgment had been tactically sound, but strategically disastrous. His solutions to immediate problems had created larger problems that proved insoluble. By ignoring Hitler's orders, Rommel had inadvertently followed Allied preferences about how German defenses should be arranged. The Desert Fox had become the unwitting architect of his own strategic defeat. In the end, Rommel's greatest victory had been achieved for the wrong side. His strategic modifications to German defensive planning had ensured that D-Day would succeed rather than fail. The field marshal who was supposed to stop the invasion had instead designed the defensive system that made invasion possible. It was the ultimate demonstration of how strategic competence without strategic alignment could produce results opposite to intentions. Rommel's brilliance had been turned against German interests by his refusal to subordinate personal judgment to command authority. The field marshal who saved D-Day had saved it for the Allies rather than for Germany. His greatest strategic achievement had been his greatest strategic failure. Rommel had ignored his orders and inadvertently changed the course of the war, just not in the direction Germany needed.